Okay. Hi, welcome to NDE TV. I'm Peggy Robinson. Today's guest is Eben Alexander, and he has an amazing story. And what I love most of all is I have brought up in other podcasts how it seems like if you've had an NDE and like you have like 2% chance of survival, like throw that paper away because it seems like an NDE changes everything, doesn't it?
It
Do you
does.
agree?
Absolutely. It can flip your worldview. I mean, the issue is they're so totally unexpected. As a former kind of materialist, physicalist neuroscientist who thought the brain creates consciousness, the physical is all there is, I was absolutely stunned by what I went through. And all at a time when the medical documentation showed that my neocortex was gone. It was offline. There was no way it was going to produce any kind of dream or hallucination. That's why the scientific community takes my NDE very seriously because of what it indicates. And of course, the other thing beyond just the fact that I had this extraordinary experience when I shouldn't have been able to even have a dream or hallucination is the fact that I had such a remarkable survival. That's why the case report that Bruce Grayson and others put out in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases about my medical records, that came out September 2018, and makes it very clear that this recovery is completely unexpected too. And for any physician who reads that case report, you realize, oh my gosh, this is a story of someone who was bound to die. At best, come back a vegetable, and yet I had a full recovery 2 months after I woke up from coma, which really has no explanation in the medical literature. Although the Dr. Grayson and Serbi Khanna and Lauren Moore, who wrote that case report, were challenged by the peer reviewers of the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases. How do you explain this case? They called it absurd that you would expect that someone that sick with that documented illness of meningoencephalitis involving all 8 lobes of my brain could end up having a full recovery. And what these 3 authors said is because he had an NDE, that he was granted this kind of miraculous healing. And that's, I think, where the important lesson is for the world, because the more we understand about this, the more we understand how we can heal, come into wholeness in this lifetime. And that's where I think the deepest lessons for NDEs are important, not just to tell us what happens when we die, but how to live this life day to day, how to think of ourselves, our relationship with the universe, our relationship with others. And that's the real power of the whole broad story of near-death experiences.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people just like to listen to the stories, which I do too. We learn a lot. I mean, I'm not saying anything against that, but it's just, I think a lot of times they're missing the point like that, like what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
They're missing the point that isn't just a interesting story and then go about
Right.
your life. I mean, they need to really understand the impact, the implications, what this is really showing us as humans here on earth, interacting with the divine. And even when we come back, the changes that we have, and we still have that interaction, and that divine still in us. Not that we're saints by no means, but, it really changes us in so many ways because we've been there.
Well, it does. And I think the other important thing about all that is you point out very rightfully so that NDEs have a remarkable power to change the life of the person who goes through it. But, Ken Ring wrote decades ago about how any human being who learns of these stories and starts to study them can gain a tremendous benefit in their own life, even if they have not had an NDE. And that's where I think it's very important to know more and more about this. And in many ways, NDEs are trying to teach us what religions have tried to teach for thousands of years. The golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated. We're all in this together. We're sharing one mind. These are kind of the profound lessons that come out of NDEs. And when you look at the life review that's happened in more than half of NDEs going back thousands of years, the life review, Karen and I often point out, is like the golden rule being written into the fabric of the universe. It just shows us we really are in this together. To hurt another is to hurt yourself. NDEs show us that in a very pure fashion. And I love how, from my perspective, NDEs now are coming to be very much more understood and validated by the unfolding science of consciousness, which takes them much more seriously than materialist or physicalist science ever did, because materialism failed to realize kind of the importance of spirituality and our spiritual nature as humans and the spiritual nature of the universe. And the fact that now it's all being fully supported by the evolving science of consciousness, which fully incorporates kind of the deep mysteries of quantum physics to come to a deeper understanding of the nature of reality. That's where NDEs are really the tip of the spear that lead this whole world towards a much grander vision of being unified, kind of in this together. You know, kindness, compassion, mercy for others are not just options, they're imperatives from these lessons that come to us from near-death experiences. And that's why this world needs to grow up and mature into a deeper understanding of what NDEs tell us about our existence.
Hopefully, maybe lead less materialistic life.
Well, it's certainly a relief from that slavery that so many of us are kind of buy into in this kind of heyday of scientific materialism and teaching us that only the material world exists. And like the guy who has the most toys at the end wins the game. Well, that's not the way it works from the perspective of NDEs. It's much more about our relationships and about helping others, especially caring for the least, the last, and the lost. I mean, that's the lesson that comes from NDEs. And I would say it's a very refreshing and liberating mindset to free us from the shackles of materialism and that kind of worship of the material as all that exists, and come to realize we're much grander beings than that. And that's what NDEs teach us in such beautiful fashion. But you don't have to have your own NDE to come to know this. This is why Karen and I often, in our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we promote very heavily the use of a meditative technique, a binaural beat brainwave entrainment, to help people get into very deep meditative states, because I'm convinced, based on our workshop results and a lot of Karen's, if you go to sacredacoustics.com and look at the testimonials page, you'll learn a lot of people benefit from this and achieve the kind of goals that you can get from having an NDE, but they don't have to have an NDE. It's merely by exploring consciousness and coming to realize it's not something created between your ears in a 3.5-pound gelatinous mass floating in a warm, dark bath that we call the brain, but that in fact the brain is only a filter that acts kind of as a veil, and we can cross through that into that primordial mind and come in direct connection with the universe. That's why mind over matter, as in placebo effect, is just the beginning. There are tremendous capabilities we have for manifesting our unfolding reality, far beyond the healing that is so obvious to medical scientists in the form of placebo effect, where thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes can have a profound role in healing. But this is really about manifesting the loftiest world of our dreams, of our higher soul. And that's where meditation is very important and allows you to come to this kind of knowledge and efficiency in manifesting your life far beyond what I ever thought possible from my materialist perspective before my coma.
Yeah. And I believe God is as close as we want him to be. I mean, if we want him way back on the back burner, or when, a crisis happens, God, I need you now. But I mean, that realm is at our fingertips, and anything that, could help a person get to that realm, whether it's prayer, whether what you're talking about, anything, I mean, that can just help us tap into that glory that is there.
Well, one interpretation of my NDE that's become very strong in the last few years, in my understanding, is just as many NDEers tell you, becoming one with that God force of pure love at the kind of pinnacle of their NDE is what allowed them to come back to this world and never have any fear of death again. They realize it's not the end. And that oneness, that becoming one with that God force of pure love and seeing all of its healing and wholeness, can be a very refreshing and liberating process. But it essentially shows us that God is the very core of our awareness and existence, as you're pointing out. That God is not distant. I remember in Proof of Heaven, the way I put it was deeply personal. Like that was a spiritual home. It feels so much like home, even more so than this world, which is surprising to people. But that's why so many NDEers would prefer to just stay in that realm, although many of them, like myself, came back to this world out of a sense of responsibility to help other souls. And in my particular case, it was really to help my younger son, who I saw in a vision at the very end of my NDE, my son Bond, who at that time was 10 years old. It was on day 7 of my coma, which incidentally was 13 years ago today that I came out of coma, November 16th of 2008.
Wow.
When I woke up from coma. Right, in fact, right now we're almost at the hour mark, because it was around noon Eastern time that I emerged from coma. But of course, when I did, my brain was still wrecked. And that's why there was, it took me 2 months for everything to come back. But that was an extraordinary period of learning. But it was that responsibility for my son Bond, who on that 7th day of coma, he'd heard the doctors talk about, I was now down from 10% to 2% chance of survival, no chance of recovery. So time to stop the antibiotics and let me go. And
Yeah.
That's when I started to come back to this world. His pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. And I didn't even have an idea who this being was. And I promise you, I did not see him with my eyes or hear him with my ears. But that pleading reminded me that I had a soul connection back to this realm that was very important. And that was a reason that I chose in that moment to start making the effort to come back to whatever this world was, even though I had no idea what that was.
That's why I come back too, my boys.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what brings so many of us back.
So for people that haven't had your story, can you take us back to that day? Because you are a completely different person than what you are sitting here talking today. I mean, you were, what you say, atheist or agnostic?
Well, I had grown up first in a Methodist church. My dad, who was an academic neurosurgeon, very scientific, but he was also very spiritual. He had a strong belief in God and Christ. He was absolutely devoted to that understanding, and he used prayer a lot in his work as a surgeon. He recognized its importance in healing. So I had that upbringing. But through my career in neurosurgery, that included 15 years teaching at Harvard Medical School, teaching neurosurgery, I was puzzled over how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. I just didn't understand it. And then as I reported in my book, Proof of Heaven, the last 8 years before my coma, I really was a kind of an agnostic. And that all was because I was adopted. And in the year 2000, I found out that my birth parents had gotten married. That was a giant shock to me. I had no idea that could be possible. I thought they'd gone their separate ways as teenagers. So I found out in the year 2000 that they'd gotten married, that they in fact had 3 children. So I had 3 biological siblings out in this world, but also they had lost the youngest sister. She had passed 2 years earlier in 1998. And I was told in that phone call by a social worker that because of that loss, they were still grieving the loss of that daughter. So it was not a good time to come back in their lives. Now, that was not the true story at all, but that's what the social worker told me because of very restrictive North Carolina laws about reuniting adoptees with their birth parents. And so anyway, I spent 8 years agnostic because that rejection, perceived rejection by my birth mother in the year 2000 led me to doubt any power of a loving personal God or power of prayer. And I basically let all that go. So I think that agnosticism was very important. A true open-minded skepticism is very valuable in this whole journey of discovery. Most of the scientists out there, though, who claim to be skeptics are really pseudo-skeptics. They've already made up their mind. They don't care about empirical data, people's reports of NDEs, things like that. They don't care about rational argument, the modern science of consciousness that supports all this under objective idealism and filter theory, as we explain in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But for real open-minded skeptics, that's a tremendous power. In fact, I was my own worst skeptic when I was first coming back from that coma. I thought it was way too real to be real. And my doctors had told me the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. But it was only as I went back to the hospital in those months after my coma, went through my medical records, talked it all over with my doctors, that I realized that brain could not have created a dream or hallucination. And so it was way too real to be real because it really occurred. That's kind of the realization that began at the end of the book, Proof of Heaven, as I explained with that picture of my birth sister that arrived 4 months after my coma. And that's when I recognized my spiritual companion from my NDE. So anyway, that's kind of a long story about that. But I guess you were asking about the journey itself and how it changed me.
Yeah, I
Well,
mean, like for people who haven't heard your story, because it just started abruptly, didn't it? Woke up with back pain.
yes, I woke up, and that was November 10th, 2008. Woke up with severe back pain, headache, and then within about 3.5 hours of symptom onset, I was having grand mal seizures and already driven deep into coma. That's when my family called the EMTs to come to our house. Now, I was in coma from that moment on. There is some confusion in the lay literature because of one article that tried to say that I was in coma due to a medication, that it was medication induced. But no, it was meningitis induced. That's why it's so important to the medical community and scientific community. Um, and so I was deep in coma by the time I first was put on any kind of sedation that was, to put me on a ventilator, 3 powerful intravenous antibiotics. And that's when the doctors did a lumbar puncture. It showed thick white pus under pressure in the fluid space around my brain and spinal cord. And at that time, the doctor who did that puncture in the ER, Dr. Laura Potter, knew that given my rapid descent to coma and the report from microbiology that it was an gram negative, which is about the worst kind of meningoencephalitis you can have, she knew I had only a 10% chance of survival. And it was by being in coma for the next 6 days into the 7th day, 1 week, when they held that family conference, because they said I'd gone down to a 2% chance of survival, no chance of recovery. And that's when it was time to let me go. But the interesting thing is, as the medical case report makes clear, and I tried to make clear in Proof of Heaven, is that brain could not have had such an experience. And that's why everything that happened, I'll describe very briefly those events, because they're all described in great detail in Proof of Heaven. But it started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm. And important to point out that an unusual feature of my NDE was that I was amnesic, that I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life, no language, no knowledge of humans, this earth, this universe. All of that was gone. Now, in the first weeks after coming back, I explained all that with my primitive pre-coma neuroscientific assumption that memory is stored in the neocortex. And therefore, if you have horrific damage to the neocortex, which I had, well documented, then you might delete memories. But I didn't know at that time how all the memories were going to come back completely, which they had done by about 2 months after coma. But anyway, I was amnesic. It started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive kind of subterranean realm, like being in dirty jello. I had tactile feeling. I could remember roots or blood vessels around me, but I had no body awareness during any part of this journey at all. It was always just a speck of observation, just witnessing things around me. And it turns out that there came a slowly spinning white light that had a perfect musical melody. And that light up and open like a portal from that ugly earthworm eye view realm where it all started into this brilliant ultra real gateway valley that had many earth-like features to it, but it was also very deeply spiritual. The earth-like features, I was on a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in these vast formations. And we were above this lovely meadow, and it was surrounded by this rich forest, very verdant, fertile, life-filled world below us, almost like Plato's world of ideals. Because there was no death or decay, no signs of any kind of imperfection. And there was all this joy and merriment because thousands of beings were in that meadow below, dancing, children playing, dogs jumping, incredible festivities. And all of it was being fueled because up above in the sky, that blue, black, velvety sky, there were these swooping orbs of pure spiritual beings leaving sparkling trails against that sky. And they were emanating chants and anthems and hymns that would thunder through my awareness and really kind of trumpeted the awe and majesty of the divine through all of that. My first reintroduction to the divine, given my amnesia in that realm, was a soft summer breeze that blew through, and it changed my awareness of everything. And I realized the divinity of that loving God behind every bit of this. That happened with that breeze. But then the entire scene seemed to support that, as I realized that all those beings down below were souls between lives, as I put it in my write-up, where I finally resorted to words many weeks later, because the things I reported happening there, like communications, were never done as words. It was done as pure conceptual flow and kind of emotional reality. It's what I call knowledge through identification. It's one of the reasons why NDEs are so difficult to explain, because they defy our earthly language. That's very good for describing a trip to Disney World, but not very good for describing these trips where time and space have completely shifted to allow you to have things like life reviews, where all the main events of your life come through boom, 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 boom in a very meaningful fashion. But it can all happen like that, if you have a cardiac arrest or something like that, and are just out for a few minutes, and yet a full-blown life review is very kind of extraordinary to go through. And it also shows you how we become much of this scene, that knowledge to identification, as I say. That's what makes it so difficult. Normally we live events in this life, in the material world, and we have a little narrative we can say about this happened and that happened, and we can kind of run it through as this little trickle of conscious awareness. But in that realm, it's like drinking from consciousness through a fire hose, that extraordinary becoming other beings. I mean, one of the hallmarks of an NDE is you feel the emotional power of your actions and even thoughts on others around you in the life review. You're not really viewing it from your perspective so much as feeling what you might have caused other people to feel. It shows us how the boundaries of self are kind of a fiction that supports what happens on this side of the veil, but on that side, we become much more one with that one mind, with that divinity, with other beings. That's where you realize if you hurt another, you're hurting yourself. That's what the life review is telling us. So anyway, in this beautiful vision in that Gateway Valley, that wasn't my endpoint. As I labeled it, it was a gateway. And those angelic choirs above, those swooping orbs up in the sky, provided yet another kind of musical portal to higher and higher spiritual realms. And I remember seeing all of four-dimensional space-time in the lowest material realms, which I could witness from that spiritual realm, all of that collapsing down. But then even that spiritual realm, the Gateway Valley, with a whole different ordering of time that I call deep time. Time flow in this world is very much part of the stage setting that allows us to live these events in a kind of a narrative of a life flow. We see in the life review how that's a fiction, because you can have all the main events that still hold residual teaching power happen in a life review. And so I also sold that deep time. Deep time is a different kind of overlying causality or causal realm that allows things like the transformation and evolution of a soul, the evolution of all consciousness occurs in that setting of deep time. But it's outside of what we call time and space. It's much more encompassing. And I remember seeing all of that collapse down until I entered what I call the core. That was kind of my ultimate destination on my NDE, the core, infinite inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with the divine light and love of that loving God force. And that's where I sensed that absolute oneness, where my very conscious awareness was sourced with that God force. And so none of us are ever any farther than that, away from that ability to connect with that God force. And in that core realm, I was told, we'll teach you many things, but you'll be going back. And that's where I saw so many visions, the visions like the flying fish and the Ender's Net version that showed me reincarnation, showed me life reviews, and how all of that is about helping us to work our way towards this deeper understanding and oneness with the divine. That I think it's kind of like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin mentioned in his mid-20th century book, The Phenomenon of Man. Evolution is occurring, but a far grander scale than just puny little Darwinian evolution of biological systems on Earth. All of consciousness throughout the cosmos is evolving, and that's what we are all part of. And that's what I could witness in that core realm, was this extraordinary vision of the multiple threads of incarnation, because I'd never accepted a reincarnation before. I thought it was nonsense. But my coma journey showed me very clearly how it's an imperative part of understanding this oneness of mind and what we all share, that we come back in multiple lifetimes to grow towards this oneness with the divine. So it's not like the blind kind of mechanistic wheel of, say, of some interpretations of the Buddhist tradition of reincarnation, where you're just trying to get off that wheel. This is much more filled with grace, with evolution, with transformation, with growth of souls, with humanity's understanding, with the knowledge of sentience throughout the cosmos. That's what this is more all about. And that's what I witnessed in that core realm. Now, in the core, as I describe it, it's where all paradoxes, all dualities are resolved into oneness. I often call it a dazzling darkness because our language seems almost nonsensical in trying to describe this unification of all that occurs in that core realm. And what would happen is I would tumble back down spontaneously to that early stage, to the earthworm's eye view. But I quickly realized that by remembering the musical notes of the melody, I could conjure up that light portal that led me up from the earthworm eye view into the Gateway Valley. So music, vibration, frequency were very essential in my spiritual journey, because that's what allowed me, remembering, what we hear as music. And of course, this is music far beyond what you could ever hear with the ear, and things you see are far beyond what you could ever see with the eye. Knowledge through identification is a much richer form of becoming and knowing about this universe and about our role in it. But I do remember this brilliant light that was there in the core realm that I viewed as kind of an interpreter or translator. Some have labeled that, a Christ energy or Christ force. And I don't know. I mean, those words really become kind of meaningless in that realm, because all of definitions start to dissolve into that oneness of mind. But anyway, I would then ascend back through these various levels, including going through that Gateway Valley. And the best part about the Gateway Valley, of course, is every time I went through there, I encountered that spiritual guide that I mentioned a few minutes ago, this beautiful young woman on the butterfly wing, who was there to reassure me. And I think her message to me was the deepest and most profound message I was to bring back to this world from my NDE. And her message that flowed into me telepathically and with the emotional reality to go with it: you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are cared for. And the other statement that was there in that moment from her: you can do no wrong. And I wish I explained that a lot better in Proof of Heaven, because I didn't elaborate on it, because I thought, from where I was at that point, when she said, you can do no wrong, I understood fully, because of where I was, that this is really about kind of that light and darkness, and always making choices out of love, not out of fear. So yes, we can make mistakes from the perspective of a human life. When we make choices out of fear and out of separation, don't realize we're all in this together. So we can make choices where we then need correction in the life review to nudge us towards that life of love, compassion, kindness. That's really the correct answer. And from my viewpoint in that spiritual realm, it was crystal clear to me that ambience of love that guides us in that direction makes it clear that our choices here on earth do matter. But I also knew that we're here to learn and teach. And there, we learn by personal experience. And that's why there is that also programmed forgetting. In the reincarnation literature, you'll realize the more than 2,500 cases, for example, studied at University of Virginia. People can learn all about that at uvadops.org. But in those cases, you have to harvest these memories of past lives before age 5 or 6. Because beyond that, they're covered up by natural processes. We're not meant to remember every bit of that as we live our lives in these bodies. But that's the gift of NDEs, is they remind us temporarily. They bring into this world, this materialistic kind of culture of ours, a reminder that we're actually spiritual beings in a spiritual universe. And
when you say that, they
lives,
told you you could do no wrong, it makes me think of, how you feel about your children.
Right.
You're going to love them no matter what, even if they do wrong, or, you can do no wrong.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. And I think that's, I think all religions came from people having these journeys, NDE type journeys into, non-material realms. And that's where it came from. But religions may not have been so clear at how they kind of conveyed all that. But I think the simplest message now coming out of the NDE community is really that same beautiful basic message from some of the prophets and mystics about oneness, kindness, mercy, that we're all in this together, because that's actually what the science is showing so well. But I love your point. That's a very good one. We love our children, or many of us tend to love our children unconditionally. And so we're familiar with that concept. And in so many ways, that's it. God has allowed us to live these lives and to have the knowledge we have. But some of that involves not necessarily remembering between lives and past lives, because I think we've built in a lot of the kind of steps, the mileposts of our journey in this life. I believe we do select as higher souls and soul groups in alignment with that infinitely loving God force between lives. But what that then includes are things like illness and injury that we would select to have in this lifetime. Now, if your ego hears that, your ego will go, no way, I did not select to have this kind of hardship in my life, to have a child commit suicide or a spouse with a terminal diagnosis when we've got young children, things like that. And yet you come to realize from the higher soul perspective that those hardships and difficulties in many ways are catalysts. They help us to grow. And it's how we deal with those hardships and how we deal with difficult people in our lives and things like that, that kind of take us back to that higher soul kind of mission. And the more we can recover love for self and others and making our choices and living these lives, the more I think we can benefit and grow as souls. That's why it's so important to have this knowledge, why NDEs are a kind of reminder of the higher soul mission we all have, including everyone who's not had an NDE too, to come to a deeper acknowledgement of our relationship with the universe and our true purpose for being. And it's very different from the kind of polarization and kind of false sense of separation that we see in our current political, economic, cultural, international world. There's a lot of polarization, and yet the NDE community and the modern science of consciousness help take us to a much richer understanding of the unity of the lessons we're here to learn and how we really need to shift our perspective and how we live these lives. And that's where NDEs are truly the tip of the spear for a revolution.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times when we're learning about these things, like maybe I'm not really sold on reincarnation, but yet I can conceive of coming back as a group, as a tribe, not just one person, but okay, let's go now as a tribe and help them get through this. I can conceive of it of that, as one person again and again instead of another person getting a chance. I can't really wrap my head around, but I think we can all come together in seeing that God is too big for us to understand and label and put in boxes and draw lines and say it's this, it's this, it's this. It's beyond all of us.
Well, yeah, it only makes sense. I mean, just like there's a giant move going on in physics now. I follow quantum physics and physics, chemistry, and general biology tremendously. But there's a huge realization in physics that to talk about things like an electron or a proton makes no sense. None of it exists independently. It's all about the quantum field and fluctuations in the quantum field where you start to make better sense of it. And likewise, in this discussion, it makes no sense to talk about an individual soul journey. We're all in this together, and the lessons and the teachings only happen from that togetherness and from our relationships. That's why they are so important. And it's especially ridiculous to take the lead from reductive materialist science. I mean, one of the hallmarks of reductive materialism, which is the conventional form of science that we're all kind of brought up with, is this notion that you do talk about the individual particles and how they interact, but that fundamentally it teaches that the particles are what exist. And they pretend that by understanding the rules that govern interrelationships with those particles, that you can then extrapolate and understand the emergence of all the big scale things that happen in human lives and in all of humanity. And that's where it gets very confusing and is misleading, because in fact, there's much more of a top-down causality than a bottom-up causality. And that top down is where you start to see the mental layer of the universe and the spiritual layer of the universe. As Karen keeps reminding me, this is not about mind over matter, it's about spirit over matter. And again, that is simply acknowledging what I mentioned a few minutes ago, that that God force is the very source of our conscious awareness. So it's available to all of us right there at the core of who we are in our very existence. So awakening to that and having that better top-down view helps us to really grow into this kind of deeper understanding of who we are. And that's where I think the importance of relationships and also that you can never look at this as that individual soul journey, but only as souls interacting, all as part as growing. It's kind of like we're sharing the dream of the one mind. And
I heard you say on a podcast here recently, I just loved it. You were at a conference or training or something, and they were talking about at the end of life, people talk about have delusions, and you stood up and took the mic and said,
"Oh yeah, that was beautiful." That was at a meeting of the hospice and palliative care physicians. There were like, I think, 6,500 members. It's a big group, and it's international. There are many countries represented. But yeah, this guy was leading the session on terminal delusions, as they called them. And the more I heard of these stories, I realized that people were also injecting terminal lucidity, or what's called paradoxical lucidity, which is an extraordinary event. And I've seen this myself. It's really mind-blowing. But people come back, even with their brain, horribly damaged from metastatic cancer, strokes, head trauma, what have you. And they might have been in coma for days, weeks, months, unresponsive. But as they approach death, they come back to life. They wake right up and are conversant with loved ones at the bedside, just smiling away as they reunite with souls of departed loved ones. And I actually had a case of that in Proof of Heaven that I put in there. And it was especially important to me because the person who reported it to me was the chairman of one of the top neurosurgical training programs on earth. So a very good and skeptical neuroscientist. And yet he saw this terminal lucidity in his own father. Undeniable. Absolutely shocked him into a realization. And he didn't realize until I told him about my experience, this was about 2 years after he'd seen this in his father, that he realized it's because of eternity of soul that he was witnessing it. And so, yes, and when I mentioned all that at the meeting, and said, in some of these cases, you've actually got terminal or paradoxical lucidity going on, which cannot be explained by materialist science, is a strong statement of our spiritual existence. And then people started sharing their own stories. And then the guy who was leading the whole thing, who was Asian, then confessed that he had grown up in a Buddhist family. And he'd always been told that some of the most important work you do is right when you're leaving this world. And so, yes, he acknowledged that maybe there was a lot more to this than just delusion. So, yeah, it was a real eye-opener session.
I love that you just stood up and took the mic and said, wait a minute. It's not delusion, it's lucidity.
The interesting thing is, as a community, medical doctors will still kind of circle the wagons around the materialist model. But individually, they'll tell you these extraordinary stories, just like I had in Proof of Heaven, things I couldn't understand. I'd seen them. They completely defied materialist thinking. And yet I thought, well, no, materialism is the correct answer. We just need to keep studying. I now realize that's completely wrong. There's no way materialism, brain creates consciousness, will ever be the answer because it's not true. Consciousness is fundamental and the brain is a filter. So obviously they're very related, but consciousness does not originate with the brain at all. And that's the biggest error in materialist thinking. And you were saying a little while ago, you weren't sure where to weigh in on the reincarnation. I'll tell you some of the strongest and most powerful vetted, objective, scientific data supporting the reality of fundamental consciousness is actually the reincarnation literature. And it's been contributed to for decades from all around this world by very skeptical, open-minded scientists. And some of the best work that I often refer people to is University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies. And you can get to that at uvadops.org. Tremendous amount of work. And as I said a little while ago, more than 2,500 cases, past life memories in children that they've studied.
I have a past life memory, and I still don't really, buy into reincarnation. Yeah, I just have this little memory of being this different girl. I was really rich and really loved by my father, and we're in a field, and a helicopter is landing, and me and my mother and father are getting ready to board the helicopter, and my father's wearing this suit, and I'm so loved and like catered to, like we're a very wealthy family, and we go and we climb in this helicopter, and I can see the pilot and co-pilot in their white shirts and their white hats, and turn around and smile and talk to me, and we start to go up, and they're trying to calm me, make sure I'm not scared, and that's it. It's like, I don't know where that comes
Wow.
from. It doesn't belong to me. But yet when
That
you
is
talk about
beautiful.
reincarnation, it's like, I'm thinking, you grow up in Christian Sunday school and church, and
Right.
then I become Catholic with my ex-husband, and so you think, well, this is it. This is one life, and then I have this memory, but then so I'm like on the fence, and so like I said, I can conceive of like coming back, like say I want to say after I pass, maybe I want to go into my granddaughter, and I want to stay there. Maybe I feel she's
Right.
going to need help. Maybe for whatever reason, she's going to be facing some dangers, and kind of like that's maybe where guardian angels come in. So I can conceive
Absolutely.
of something like that, but like to live another life over as a different person, as if none of this mattered, or, so it's just a personal thing.
Yeah, well, that's beautiful that you share that. And I guess the problem for me, because I've had very strong past life memories too, but as the objective scientist, I like to then prove it. I like to then vet it, find the details, confirm the details of the past life that somebody actually lived that. And that's where I've run into trouble with my own personal past life memories, is trying to get enough detail that you could actually do that research. It sounds to me like you've got a beautiful past life memory where you might be able to dig up the kind of details that could help you confirm it. But it's so important to recognize this, the reincarnation literature, and certainly for Christians, I will acknowledge that there are some beautiful books out there that make it very clear that back at the time of Christ, reincarnation was very accepted. In fact, in the Bible, Christ talks about John the Baptist as being a reincarnated prophet from an earlier time. There's a book by Dr. Herbert Puryear. It's called Why Jesus Taught Reincarnation. Makes it very clear that back in those days, Christ accepted reincarnation as a reality of life. But the church, as it was being organized in the decades after, or centuries after the death of Christ, realized that in some ways, the notion of reincarnation would steal some power from the church. They thought, we've got to tell people that they only live one life, and then their ticket to heaven or hell for eternity is determined by the church giving them that ticket with a belief system, like get out of jail free
Yeah,
card.
it does feel anti-Christian.
Yeah, and so the reality is reincarnation is perfectly consistent with the early teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, okay? They don't defy that at all, but the later teachings of the church, and it was Constantine, really, a Roman emperor, who made it heretical to talk about reincarnation. In fact, he suggested punishment by inverse crucifixion, which was the cruelest form of execution that he knew of, because he really didn't want anybody talking about reincarnation, because when they had the Counts of Nicaea and they were kind of putting together the new model of Christianity, they did not want that kind of talk around because it would take away the power of the church. When you open your mind to it, especially all the scientific evidence for reincarnation, and you also realize that NDEs bring with them the lessons that were trumpeted by early prophets and mystics like Christ, of love, of oneness, compassion, kindness, mercy. You realize there's nothing threatening about reincarnation at all. And the fact that it supports this kind of eternity of soul is a very important part of it, as this whole world grows out of the simplistic, paltry fiction of materialism, which is completely false. The idea of brain creates consciousness, our existence is birth to death, nothing more. We need to get rid of that fiction because it allows people to live very irresponsible lives. We are responsible for our choices. It's all about loving our fellow beings, and those deep and profound lessons that early religions tried to teach are now being fully validated and supported by the emerging science of consciousness, with its focus on oneness of mind. Just as quantum physicists said a century ago, there seems to be one consciousness, and it's not created by the brain. And they were right on the beam. I love Werner Heisenberg's quote. He won the Nobel Prize Physics for quantum physics, 1962, and he said, your first gulp from the glass of natural sciences will lead you towards atheism, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. And as a quantum physicist, he knew that the ultimate lesson as we came to understand quantum physics was going to be the top-down causality, the mental layer of the universe, that spirit over matter that Karen keeps proposing as better than mind over matter, because essentially it's all about that God force and coming to know that. And NDEers bring that back to this world in a very strong fashion, that it's all really about love and compassion, kindness and mercy.
Yeah, I'm trying to build a bridge between the religious and the spiritual, instead of two opposite ends of a spectrum, that we could come together and not be so afraid, intimidated, because there is far out, like New Age, and then there is strict religion, and there's got to be something to bring us all together where we can find a common ground, I think.
Well, I think that's a beautiful statement for our current very polarized and fragmented and confused times. And for years now, I've realized that near-death experiences really are the tip of the spear that help to unify so many things. I mean, when you realize, as I did after my NDE, that it doesn't matter if you want to call that force of infinite love and healing that you encounter, call it God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit. I don't care what words you use. We're all ultimately talking about the same thing, that we're all together bound in love, and that is the deep lesson, that the answers will be found in the middle, not at these polar extremes, but it's all about the kind of commonality we share, the origins we share with that binding force of love. And the more we can end up bringing that into our thoughts and actions, our writings, our living, our lives, the choices we make every day with each other, with how we face hardships, don't choose fear, but choose love and compassion and mercy. This world will become a far better place as these lessons percolate through the world. And I would say a lot of the damage to the world has been that false sense of separation that is promulgated by materialist thinking, scientific materialism, reducing it all down to the electrons and protons, pretending that if we understand how they work, that then tells us how all of this works. No, there is a true top-down causality. And that is something that Karen and I wrote about extensively in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. And anybody who wants to learn more can go to ebenalexander.com, find out more about that book, Proof of Heaven, The Map of Heaven, and a lot more of what we do.
I actually have read your books.
Well, good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad. What did you think of Living in a Mindful Universe?
Well, the first one, what's the name of the first one?
Proof of Heaven.
That one, what stuck in my mind more than the rest, because it was like beyond beyond my educational level, and I got lost, and like I have trouble with short-term memory, and so I really had to take notes when I read.
Okay.
But the first one is what really, the story is where usually something connects my heart to, is a story.
Right. Well, I would say that's still, so many people still reach out to us every day, and it includes people from all different kind of belief systems, including a lot of scientists and engineers and kind of high-end intellectuals who are very grateful for Proof of Heaven. And I think in many ways, it is that nice, simple, straightforward story that so many people get. In fact, a lot of people have told me, people who have both listened to the audiobook and read the written book, and the words are identical, and yet they tell me they get so much more out of the audio version, because a lot of communication from the heart, the authenticity, comes through the voice, and it's not necessarily apparent on the written page. And I find, especially in this very trying time with COVID, with more than 700,000 dead Americans and millions dead around this world, all the bereavement, all the people dying without family nearby. I mean, it's been a very challenging time. And to me, it's very heartening that people in that environment find Proof of Heaven to be such a comfort, to help them realize our souls are eternal, that they will see their loved ones again, that it's all about the relationships, and that the death of a body does not mean the end of a soul. And I think that's a very crucial lesson that comes out of all of this, including all the science of it. We go deeply into the science and living in a mindful universe. In fact, I often tell people proof of heaven is more like a question mark. It simply says, wow, these experiences are real. They'll shock you no end. They're totally unexpected. And yet they're a beautiful and refreshing gift. Map of heaven was about, they're very common. They occur in all kinds of people, not just me. But then living in a mindful universe is the true proof of heaven. That's where we really unite science and spirituality, talk about how the scientific movement around consciousness is moving in one direction now. It's away from materialism and towards a much richer understanding of our spiritual nature and the spiritual nature of the universe. So many people are grateful, not only for proof of heaven and map of heaven, but especially for what living in a mindful universe brings to those with a kind of scientific, intellectual, and kind of modern rigor of analysis and trying to make sense of this world and understand it. So I think all three books can help people.
The moment that you realize the connection to your adopted, or not adopted, but your sister, your biological sister,
mm-hmm.
The moment you were realizing that connection, I felt like I was in the room with you when you realized. I felt so in tune to you at that moment when you're like, wait a minute. When you saw that picture, that's absolutely the girl and the butterfly.
A mind bender. I mean, it brought me to my knees. I couldn't even stand up. For 30 minutes, I was just so shocked. It just proved to me the reality. It seemed way too real to be real because it actually happened. And I love that picture. Looking at her, it's almost like she's looking at me like, do you finally get it? Like, gosh, you're dense. Yeah, that's it. I finally get it. It took me 4 months after my coma to put the pieces together, but wow, what a realization that was. And from that moment on, it's just been, I knew I had to share my story, from that point on, even though, a lot of kind of trepidation about going public with a story that might wreck my career as a neurosurgeon. I was very cautious about that. And yet I knew this is so extraordinary. And my recovery, I knew that that medical recovery and the medical documentation of it was so extreme that anybody with medical knowledge would be astonished by this story. And that's why that medical case report that came out in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases in September 2018 is so important. And people can get to that on my website. If they go to ebenalexander.com, look at my blog postings, go back to the posting of September 2018, you'll find in the third paragraph a link directly to the case report itself. And the blog walks you through the whole case report about why it's important. But it was objective third-party information confirming, in fact, making a stronger case for just how ill I was and how impossible it would be for that brain to produce any kind of dream or hallucination. That's why the case report is so important. It also makes a tremendous argument for my recovery being due entirely to the spiritual content of the near-death experience.
I've just heard too many times to be a coincidence that someone is, almost dead, should have been dead, whatever their medical condition, and they know they're going to be fine, or they just are, and they break the odds. And it just seems like, okay, this person claims they've had NDE, as if somebody would say that right off the bat, it's a big thing. But let's just throw those odds away because they had a near-death experience, and it's been proven that they may make it after all without any major problems.
Well, that's the interesting thing. And when you review like some of the other examples, not just my case, but look at Anita Moorjani. She wrote the book Dying to Be Me, and she had an advanced stage 4 lymphoma that should have killed her within hours. And yet she had an NDE. She knew she'd come back. And by coming back, she knew the cancer would disappear, which it did. So hers is a beautiful case. She talks about that a lot. She gives many presentations about that. Anybody who doesn't know her story, check Anita Moorjani out.
Yeah.
The other that I often talk about is Dr. Mary C. Neal, the orthopedic surgeon who wrote that book, To Heaven and Back. I've presented with her several times, just an absolutely beautiful story. And yet she started with an over 30-minute warm water drowning. And anybody in medicine knows you don't come back from that. Well, she did. She had a full recovery from an over 30-minute warm water drowning, which anybody will tell you is fatal. And yet they brought her to the surface dead, resuscitated her, and she ended up making a full recovery, and tells a beautiful, beautiful story
My NDE
about
actually saved my life when I was 25. I had ectopic pregnancy because as soon as I got to the hospital in the emergency room and the wheelchair pushed me back to the exam room is when my head just went down. And then suddenly I'm through the tunnel. I'm in heaven, have this whole near-death experience. I'm
wow.
begging to come back to raise my boys. And then when I
Oh,
was back, I thought, what the hell was that? Was my exact
yes,
thought. Because I was just in heaven accepting it. And now I'm back. And my pain was gone, my nausea, everything was gone. And I thought, how am I going to prove to my doctor something is serious here? Because I just died and I felt like Cinderella has till midnight. I only had
right,
a window of time now that I'm back to get my doctor to believe me, because I called him all week and I said, something is wrong. I think it's a tubal pregnancy. And he would say, Peggy, I did an ultrasound before, both babies are in the uterus. It's not
wow,
a tubal pregnancy. And I thought, so now I'm back and I'm fine. I have no symptoms. So my doctor was on call. He come in. I thought, oh, good. It's my doctor, not somebody else. He prepped me for a DNC and then he sat me up. He's Peggy, he says, your uterus is still intact. Why do you keep saying it's a tubal pregnancy? And I could not, mum's the word. I
right,
couldn't open my mouth because back then in 86, there was no such thing as near-death experience.
right.
I thought it never happened to anybody ever. And I thought he would send me to the psych ward and I would die
Right.
there. And so I said, well, I'm not going home. And he looked at my husband like, what's wrong with her? And he's, well, if it make you feel better, since you live an hour away, we can admit you overnight, but nothing's wrong. And he just looked at me like, she's nuts.
Yeah,
And
you
all
did.
night I kept waking up with that pain back in my hip again and passing out. And when I was on Dr. Oz, he told me, he says, every time you passed out, you died. And I always thought I did, but I never had another near-death experience. I would just come back to and say, God, I know you can't keep doing this. Please just keep me alive till morning. Hopefully the doctor will come in early, send me to ultrasound right off the bat, and then he'll find out what's wrong. Because if it's not tubal, something's killing me here. And then
Right.
they found out the next morning. So my doctor come in early, sent me down to ultrasound, and they said, it's the biggest tubal pregnancy this hospital I ever saw. He said, you got an internal bleeding filling your entire abdominal cavity clear up to your chest. And they
Whoa.
sent
That's a
me
big
to sign
deal.
away my organs instead of surgery. And they called my whole family and said she's not going to make it. But, I think,
Wow.
so decades later, I'm thinking about coming out about my story. I'm going to look like crazy. I'm going to look like a liar, whatever, which I did tell, right after the fact, but then, I had to do with it.
Right.
And so I thought, maybe somebody will hear my story and speak up and say, hey, maybe this was a near-death experience. Something happened. I thought it was a dream last night. Maybe it was a near-death experience. So, doctor, please look at me well. Don't dismiss me because something's going on. If people could see that as a symptom of
Right.
near death, that something's wrong, when the doctors are saying I don't see nothing,
Right.
then I would feel, content. If one person could, life could be saved because they was able to speak up when I wasn't.
Well, that's a very good point you make. And I think especially important that people realize the amount of healing that can occur when you know about these stories. You know how other people have been able to have these spiritual journeys and come back to this world. And that's where having it, praying for a relative who's ill or praying for your own illness can be very helpful at bringing that kind of extraordinary healing into this world. Just to know that it's happened, it helps us to believe in the possibility of its truth, and it brings tremendous healing to all of us. That's another reason why sharing these stories widely is so important. According to Gallup polls, there are probably something like 15 million Americans who have had NDEs, but most people have not talked about them because they worry somebody's going to think I'm crazy. They're going to put me on meds for this. It's such an extraordinary, ultra real experience to go through. You don't know where it came from, and it's so shocking. And that's why I think getting it out there with the literature, commonly telling these stories, everybody who's had one, share one. In fact, one of the reasons I wrote Proof of Heaven was to help wake up not just the community at large, or the civilization at large, but the medical community in particular to the reality of these stories so that people would share them. The more doctors and nurses share these things widely and encourage patients to share them, the more we can all wake up to the deep and profound and refreshing, liberating truth about the nature of our existence, eternity of soul, our connectedness with each other, and how love can have such a tremendous power in bringing healing and wholeness to our lives.
Well, 30 years ago, I went I always kept my same doctor that happened with. And I said, there's something I want to tell you for 30 years. I took my husband with me and the nurse was standing there. And he says, well, you better tell me then. And I told him briefly about my NDE. And he said, I believe you. And the nurse says, oh, he does too. He says, I have come to believe after all of my years of practice, what you're
Right.
saying right there is the truth. And I want to thank you so much because you coming out as a neurosurgeon saying you had an NDE done so much for the rest of us who might be afraid. Well, I was just a counselor investigator and I didn't want to come out, look like a crazy person, that I had an NDE. And then I see you come out. And I know millions of NDEers have seen you come out, and it's given us all credibility. And I just thank God so much for bringing you back and your courage for telling your story and helping the cause.
Well,
I
once I
really
realized
applaud
what had
you.
happened, there was no doubt in my mind about what I had to do. I had to go public with my story. And I knew it would be at some risk to my career. I had no idea it was going to lead to a best-selling book as it did. But, you know, God has a beautiful way of working through all of us, and all of these stories are important. And that's why it's so crucial for everyone who has such an experience to share it,
Yes.
because there's a tremendous amount of commonalities to suggest a very deep reality to these stories. And that's where the world can benefit tremendously from this revelation.
I always say tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may. But when it comes to NDEs, I think we don't realize what beautiful chips those may be.
Right, exactly. And of course, truth, the long arc of history bends towards truth and justice. And these are empirical events that happen to a tremendous number of people. So, of course, they're part of our deeper truth that must be shared. Thank
And
you,
I think
Peggy.
they are the voice of hope in
They
these
are
horrible
indeed.
times right now, too.
Well, thank you, Peggy, and
Thank
thanks for
you.
all you do to get this out to the world. It's beautiful.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.